Welcome back. We've had 4 months of non-stop hate, war, conflict, competition. It's not about tariffs. It's about envy. When you are going down and other people are coming up, you do whatever it takes so that they don't pass you. However, this is not how the history of the world has been unfolding. This is the European perspective. According to the Europeans, the world started 300 years ago when they started moving out of Europe to the rest of the world. As everyone can see, Europe is 10% of the world or even less, and America is a consequence of Europe. So we have a worldview, which is European, of the last 300 years. The rest of the world doesn't exist. India, China, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America do not exist. It's just Europe. And it's all about empires, empire building, empire maintenance, controlling others, stealing their commodities, military power, zero-sum game, guns, cannons, bombs, flying machines. And everyone has been blitzed like the Men in Black. Click. And people have no idea. They have no memory. They have no reference of what really happened, at least over the last 2,000 years. According to the latest research and statistics, in the last 2,000 years, for 1,800 years, India and China have been responsible for 80% of global wealth, global GDP, gross domestic production. Rome, the great Rome, was 5 to 10% of GDP. Byzantium, another 5 to 10%. This is where there was prosperity. And it was not based on hegemony, on empire building. It was based on commerce, without tariffs, without war. People today have been blinded. They think that commerce is about manufacturing. Manufacturing, industry, is a small part of commerce. We have had commerce in India and China for thousands of years, and they had manufacturing. In fact, in the year 1800, India was the world's largest manufacturer, followed by China. They made the clothes, the shoes. They even made guns. What they didn't have was the Industrial Revolution, because their idea was commerce. It was not empire building. So they did not stop everything just to produce guns and more guns and better guns and bigger guns. They produced all kinds of products. In India's case, spices, teas, all kinds of silks and chiffon and georgettes, and all kinds of diamonds and sapphires and rubies, apart from sugar, which is Indian, shakar. Opium was a medicine, cotton, rice, all kinds of tropical fruit. So they did not interrupt everything just to build arms, weapons of destruction, which is what the Europeans did. When in 1850 the Europeans began their great industrial expansion, they focused everything on arms. It's called the arms race. Weapons and bigger weapons and more weapons. And the French, German, English, Russians, the French and Germans, the English and the Russians, all were building bigger weapons and looking at each other. And weapons don't feed you. They don't create a better life for you. But they make you more powerful militarily. So you're there in Europe and you have a lot of guns and you see other people, India, the most prosperous country, China, very, very rich, Southeast Asia, 50, 60 states full of wealth and prosperity, African kingdoms, rich, full of commodities. And you're in the middle of nowhere in rain and snow. So you produce hundreds of cannons, put them on ships, and go all over the world robbing and stealing. And when your sailors get fed up of killing and murdering and robbing and stealing, they become pirates. And all the piracy around the world, it was not just in the Caribbean. In the Indian Ocean we had pirates, English, Spanish, British pirates, stealing the ships that were stealing from India and China. There's a saying, if you steal from someone who's stealing, you have a pardon. So the pirates were stealing from the European nations, which were stealing. They were robbing and killing based on weapons, the power of weapons. However, that lasted for around 150 years. We can say from 1850 to 2000. The world was dominated by military power of Europe and the United States. It's very little, 150 years. And during those 150 years, it was non-stop war and violence amongst themselves in Europe. The First World War, the Second World War, etc. The Cold War between Russia and the United States and Europe and NATO. So it's Europeans killing themselves. The rest of the world were just watching and saying, what's going on? These people don't like to be happy. They don't like to be healthy. They don't like their children and women to have a safe life. What's going on? Why is there so much war and violence? So we had 2,000 years ago Rome, which was a mess. It was poverty. It was not great. When you use the word great, it doesn't mean anything. It means that you're a narcissistic person. We are great, everything is great, everything we do is great, and the rest do not exist. Today, 85% of the world's population live here, as they always did. 2,000 years ago, it was here. This was basically non-existent. So when you try to show that history begins 200 years ago when you are in charge because of weapons, it doesn't give a true perspective of what really happened. And my idea in my channel and in my videos is to put a clearer, better, truer perspective on what happened in the last 2,000 years. So people have an idea of things that they have never imagined because it has been cut out of their convenient history. What most people don't know is that in this 150 years, from 1850 to the year 2000, of great European American world domination, there was no world domination. They sent their armies and people were massacred. The United States lost the war in Vietnam. They lost the war in Afghanistan. They lost the war in Iraq. How do we know? The communists are in charge in Vietnam today. The Taliban are in charge today in Afghanistan. And the Iraqi, principally the Shia pro-Iranians, are in charge of Iraq. So all the trillions of dollars and hundreds and thousands of lives, American lives, that were sacrificed in the last 50, 60 years have been in vain. It was not great anything. It was a horror. And how did this happen? First of all, from the 1850s to 1900, The West was one. They brought the immigrants from Europe to steal the gold of America. Then from 1900 to 1950, they had 50 years of innovation with Rockefeller and JP Morgan, electricity, factories. How? Based on the gold that was stolen over the last 50 years. From 1850 to 1900, a lot of money was coming in. They used this money for industrial expansion. However, as soon as the wars began in Europe, all this money went into arms. And after the Second World War, everybody was penniless. It was a horror. When I lived in Europe in the 1960s, it was all destruction. It was a misery. England was a horror show. I lived in America in the 1980s. There was nothing. New York was a horror show full of crime. Something happened. 25 years of money laundering. From 1970 to 1995, 2000. 25, 30 years of money laundering. 300 billion a year. And the Americans laundered the money and lent money to Brazil, to Argentina, with high interest rates. Southeast Asia, high interest rates. So when I started living in Brazil, Brazil was paying $50 billion a year on loans, soft loans that they didn't need, for roads going to nowhere, for nuclear factories. In Brazil, they don't need nuclear factories. They have solar energy, hydro energy. They have all kinds of, they export oil and gas. But it was forced onto them by selling weapons with the loans. You give the military leaders loans and you sell them weapons and you keep them in South America for 50 years. So from Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, etc., all these people were being fed third-class weapons that the Americans didn't need anymore. Ex-Vietnam, ex-Second World War, and the loans were bringing in $50, $60 billion per country. And this money was used for the NASDAQ boom. And all the money from narco traffic, from money laundering, from usury, lending money, which is not yours, was used to create a housing boom and a high-tech boom. The high-tech boom collapsed in 2001 when everybody realized that it's just a scam. And the housing boom collapsed in 2007, 2008 when everybody realized it was a scam. It's all lies. It's all lies. They stole the gold and then they laundered the drug money and colonized the rest of the world, forcing loans upon them and charging high interest rates. And then in the 1970s, they dollarized everything and started printing dollars. And nobody really understood what's going on. And so for the next 50 years, from the 1970s to today, the Americans have been printing and printing and printing. And everybody is also printing. The Europeans are printing. The Japanese are printing. And it's debt. So America, Europe, and Japan, and even the Chinese owe over 200% of their GDP in debt, which is really, it's astronomical. And there is no progress. There is no prosperity. It's debt, debt, debt. If you go to the bank and borrow $1 million, you're not a millionaire. You owe $1 million. America owes around $40 trillion, just the government. The United States of America, over $200 trillion. So there's no prosperity. There's no business. This is called financialism. So in the year 1990 to 2000, they created a new game, the game of financialism. Send the factories to China, lend money to everybody, and put your money in the financial markets, especially Wall Street. Forget about High Street. Forget about the working class. Forget about jobs. Stay with the top tech companies in Wall Street. And everybody is earning money, because when everybody puts their money and starts buying houses or buying stock, the market goes up. But it's valuation. It's not that you're creating value. The valuation means that the house that was 500,000 is $1 million. But be careful. In the crash of 2008, many houses crashed 20, 30, 50%. This is not real money, it's fictitious money. And many people took home equity loans on their properties. And they went bankrupt. The society went bankrupt. And they kept printing money. So you have a society that does not study, that does not produce, and that wants the best of everything. Cheap products. Okay, the Chinese worked for 20 years providing cheap products to the Americans. The Indians outsourced American offices and started doing things for the Americans for a very cheap price. But be careful. You don't use it, you lose it. I'll say it again. You don't use it, you lose it. You don't use your brains, you become stupid. You don't work, you become useless. You just sit in front of the screens watching weapons of mass distraction. And behind your back, the weapons of mass destruction are being produced and sent to Israel, sent to Ukraine, sent all over the world. And there are wars everywhere. And this is the world we're living in. And so it's very easy to blame the Chinese, just like they blamed the Colombians in the 1980s, and then the Islamist terrorists that they trained in the year 2000. They're always blaming other people. But the fact is, they don't want to study, they don't want to work, and they don't want to invest in themselves. They want other people to work for them. So to finalize this video, it's very important to clarify something. When you have been living in this imperialistic mode, supremacy mode, Western exceptionalism, we are above everybody else. We are the only thing that matters. Only our history counts. You create generations of arrogant people, useless people, rude people. They treat everybody as slaves. They ignore women because women were not part of this horror show. They were kept in the kitchens and in the factories when the men were killed. So they ignore women, and all the minorities are humiliated because you need someone to pick on, to criticize, to step on. And there is a saying, either you lick the boots or they will kick you in the face. And these military boots have been walking over the West, and then they got on boats and walked all over the world, invading, colonizing, raping, pillaging. There's a song called "These Boots Keep on Walking." The boots have been walking for 150 years from Western Europe, all over the world, and the United States, let's say 100 years, all over the world. The footprints of invading boots that unless you lick them, they kick you. And this is why in Latin America, everybody has turned against the Americans. In Africa, they don't want to see European white faces. And the Asians are becoming fed up and getting together. The Chinese are uniting with the Indians, with the Koreans, with the Japanese, all Southeast Asians, because they have finally realized that the Western boots are made not for walking, for kicking and stomping and invading other people. Rest in peace where you are. You do not need to invade and create wars. Find something useful to do. Work, study, make products that people buy, not because they're forced to, but because they're cheap and useful and helpful. And these are the clients of the future. So finalizing, it's a sequential video understanding what has been happening over the last 150 years. There was a meeting in Berlin and they carved up Africa in the 1850s. This is yours, this is mine, and okay. And King Leopold of Belgium killed 10 million innocent people of Congo so that they could steal diamonds for Belgium and for himself. So these things have happened and are still happening. What the Israelis are doing to Palestine is basically the same thing the Europeans did in Africa, in South America, when they exterminated the native people. So this is a true version, a real version of history over the last 2,000 years. Not just 150 years of glory, we won, we were the greatest, we were the best. The West, the collective West, was not the greatest, what was not the best. It was a horror show. And this is what we have to re-examine, review, revisit. Everything needs to be revisited with true eyes, not with fake news and fake stories and fake history. It's a real history of the world, not fake narratives. There is a revelation. People around the world are beginning finally to see the dust is settling. And everything that I have been trying to communicate, not just over the last 6 months to a year, but over the last 25, 30 years, people are finally beginning to understand. Thank you for watching.